We should live above the leftist policies and the right policies, and we should find a way to rise above all of that. The fear is real. The risk is real. The way that we might lose our lives in the process, the way that we might lose our position, our churches might lose their influence, all of that is real. Embrace it, hug it, love it, lean into it. That's exactly what we were called to do in the first place.
Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, his church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome to another edition of the Q Podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons, and so glad you're joining us today. And we're talking about a conversation and a topic that has really been something we've seen in the headlines over the last couple of years, and it continues to grow. And it's this topic of understanding what is happening in the Middle East, and specifically the effect on refugees. You know, many of us see the news, and many times we become numb to it. We see so much around a topic like this, and sometimes feel so helpless. We don't know how to engage it, and we don't want to engage it anymore. Well, today we're asking you to engage it. We have to. This is one of those stories where 30 years from now, our kids will be asking us, what were you doing as this crisis was happening? I mean, people look at this humanitarian crisis as one of the greatest ones, one of the greatest movements of refugees that we've seen. And it's one of those moments where the church has to respond. We have to lead the way forward. And so today you're going to get educated quickly, not only from an expert who's leading one of the largest humanitarian organizations in the world, but also from somebody who lives in Iraq. We want to talk to somebody who's actually living there with their family, with their kids, who lives there specifically on mission to serve and to love those who need our help. And so as we open up this conversation for you today, I want you to take a moment. I want us to put on the thinking that somebody who leads a humanitarian organization that's servicing so many different countries and nations, World Vision has over 44,000 employees, so they are huge. And when their leader, their president says, this is the most serious thing happening in the world and we better pay attention, well, you better believe I'm listening, and I hope you're listening too. And so I introduce to you the president of World Vision, Stearns, who's describing for us what's happening in the Middle East and kind of the fragile nature of this particular region in the world as it's beginning to crumble and as we're starting to see the fallout of that. Let's listen in.
You know, we've got Syria and Iraq and ISIS and the Ebola pandemic in Africa. We've got civil wars in the Central African Republic and South Sudan. Religious persecution in the Middle East as well. And it goes on and on and on in terms of the headlines in our world that are frightening and that we as Christians are trying to make sense of, right? How do we make sense of what's going on in the world and what is our role in doing it? The Syria crisis I want to focus on for a bit right now because it is the most profound crisis of human suffering in our world today, and it is virtually being ignored by the American people and by the church, sadly, in terms of the humanitarian response to human suffering. I just published a piece today, I think it's on the Fox News website, called Why Syria Needs an Earthquake. Now, why would a humanitarian guy like me wish an 8.0 earthquake on Syria? It's for this reason. If Syria had an 8.0 earthquake today, we would care. We would respond. We would reach out and help the broken people and the homeless people from that earthquake. The news would cover it 24/7, and we would respond. But we're now in the 5th year of the Syrian war. There's more than 200,000 dead. There are 12 million displaced people, 12 million displaced people. The Haiti earthquake only displaced maybe 1 million, 1.5 million people. Half of these displaced people, refugees and internally displaced IDPs, fleeing to Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey and other countries, half of these 12 million are children. They're children, they're kids. And if there were 6 million American children living in refugee camps, going through the winter in tents without coats and blankets, if American mothers were giving birth to 40,000 babies a year living in refugee situations, the church here would do something about it. the church would do something about it. I want to read you a quote. I was in refugee camps in Jordan a while back, and I met a group of girls who were refugee children. There was a 10-year-old girl named Haya, and all the girls had been told to write me a letter because there was this big shots coming from the United States, and maybe he can help, and maybe he can tell your story when he gets an opportunity. So this was what 10-year-old Haya wrote. She said, "Peace to you. I'm talking on behalf of the Syrian children, calling on you, the people of the other world. Have you ever thought of Syria? Have you ever thought of the children of Syria, my country, Syria? We fear you've forgotten us. Please, my name is Haya, and my father was killed. I loved my father so much, now I will never see him again. Syria is in pain. Syria is bleeding. She is crying for her children. Her children were her candles, and they have faded out."
Wow.
From a 10-year-old girl. You know, Gabe, I just want to make the point that the frustration we have right now is asking the question, where's the American people, where's the church in responding to this huge humanitarian crisis that's affecting children? Is it because they're Muslim? Is it because this is a man-made crisis? Is it because it's kind of mind-numbing and the politics are so complicated we just don't know what to do? Or is it the media not covering it? But imagine the opportunity that this presents to the church to respond to this huge humanitarian crisis. And by the way, many churches in Lebanon and Jordan are trying to respond without resources. Imagine if on the news media, while ISIS is beheading Christians, Christians are feeding Muslims in the camps and showing the love of Christ.
Yeah.
This is the opportunity for the church to respond.
That's what I love about World Vision. Your commitment is to serve whoever's in front of you that's in need. They don't have to pass a Christian qualification to receive World Vision services. You're serving every neighbor, and in many cases demonstrating what it looks like to be in a pluralistic setting, the way we experience it in America, but in these developing places. So it feels a little hopeless, though. I mean, I got to say, you watch this, hear what you're saying, and I'm just wondering, is there any sort of silver lining to this discussion? I mean, how can people sitting here today even think about this well and try to imagine a future that could look different and how the church can be engaged in it?
Well, I've got 4 minutes to describe the rest of the world for you, but I think first I want you to hear that there is really good news about poverty, the silver lining. Poverty is in retreat in the world, extreme poverty, people living on less than $1.25 a day. And we're going to put up some statistics here in a minute, if we can jump to that slide, that show where, I think we're a little bit out of order, but it shows that there have been huge declines in poverty. More than 2 billion people have gotten clean water. Child mortality rates have been slashed in half. Maternal mortality rates have been slashed in half. There are fewer hungry people in the world. The future of poverty is moving into what we call fragile states, what the UN calls fragile states. It's about 50 countries in the world. You see them on the map. These are the countries that are broken by war, corrupt or incompetent governments, ethnic tensions, lack of human rights available to the people there. And these 50 fragile states represent just 19% of the global population, but 50% of extreme poverty in our world. And here are these statistics. Again, 19% of the population, but in these countries, it's 77% of the children that are not in school. It's 70% of all the under 5 child mortality in the world. It's 65% of the people in the world who lack clean water. 60% of the hungry live in the fragile states. And these fragile states collectively are 63% Muslim. And many of them fall in the 1040 missions window. So the future of poverty, as we defeat poverty and push it back in so many other places in the world, the battle is moving to the fragile states.
Yeah.
That's where the battle's going.
So I think for many people, because over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of good organizing around how do we dig wells in Africa and how do we, and churches can get their head around that, let's raise $10,000. We see something physical happen that's helping good go forward. But then you talk about solving something like the Syrian refugee crisis, and I'm just like, it's too much. Like how do we engage? I know you go to work every day thinking about it, but what is the opportunity for us as we think about the fragile states, 63% Muslim, you see on the orange on the map, and it's really pretty focused.
Yeah. And our natural inclination is to turn away. It's ugly stuff. It's not pleasant. I always say I never get invited to dinner twice because this is all I talk about. I'm really a horrible dinner guest. And those of you having dinner with me tonight, please come because there are a few of you. But you know, Jesus calls us into the margins. He doesn't call us into comfort, into our comfort zones. He calls us out of our comfort zones and into the margins. And again, imagine the opportunity for the church. A lot of this conference this week is focused on the culture and what they think of us as Christians. I want you to think about the opportunity of showing the culture the Jesus that everybody loves. The Jesus that everybody loves, the Jesus that's with the widow and the orphan and the alien and the stranger and the people who are sick, people who are in prison. Imagine if Christians were feeding Syrian Muslims in a refugee camp while ISIS is beheading Christians. Imagine the witness that we can have in the world. And I want you to see a really important truth that is, now I'm going to get very theological on you, but if we take the great commandment to love our neighbors as ourselves, and of course, that includes loving our neighbors all over the world and the most desperate people in the world. Jesus calls us to love those people, to be tangible ambassadors of his love. So the great commandment is pointing us to these 50 broken countries, the hardest places in the world to work. The Great Commission to make disciples of all nations is sending us to the 1040 window. It's sending us to countries where Christianity is not welcome often. And so the Great Commission is pointing us to the same place the Great Commandment is pointing us to. And the future of mission for the church in the world in the 21st century, I believe, is converging in these places. These are the hard places. It's hard work. It's not easy to do, and you've got to have the will to do it. My fear is that the church will not rise to this great opportunity and great challenge in the 21st century. And I hope you as church leaders will rise to that challenge and will respond.
So you just got a big picture of what's taking place in the Middle East. And there's a couple specific things I want you to take a moment to do if you can. And that is to learn a little bit more about what's happening. You know, one of the compelling stories that World Vision has told, and it's been very compelling to me, to my kids, is to see the life of a child who's a refugee. And there's this little boy named Ali. And there's an opportunity where you can actually go and watch this 360-degree video. It's basically like virtual reality, but you can go watch it on your computer, and you can watch it by texting 44888. And if you'll just write down that number and text the letters QVR, so QVR to 44888, they'll actually send that video to you, and you can watch it on your phone, and you can immediately see what life looks like for a little boy who's trying to live in a refugee camp. The second thing I want to tell you about, especially if you're a church leader or you're in your church, you know who you could email about this and let them know that your church needs to participate in something we call Refugee Sunday, where churches are actually inviting their people to better understand what's happening with this crisis and to know how to respond, to actually care for people right where they're at in the Middle East. You know, we hear a lot about refugees because we know that many have spilled into Europe and some are coming into America, and so it's become a big political debate. Well, the vast majority, over 95%, will never leave the Middle East. They'll never leave that region. They don't want to leave. They want to stay right where they're at, and they need help and they need support. And our churches, what a moment for our churches to come alongside and actually help them by meeting them with their medical needs, with food, with shelter, with all of the basic necessities these families need who just fled Syria and surrounding areas with just the clothes on their back. You can do that and learn more about it at qideas.org/refugees. And if you'll go to that site, you'll see there's a 4-minute film that we helped produce and create that really lays out the story beautifully for the congregation. And so everybody can watch that, and then your church can participate by taking an offering that specifically goes to help the refugees on the ground. And so I'd encourage you to do that. And I want you to stick around for this next 9 minutes because it's quite compelling as you hear somebody who lives in Iraq. His name's Jeremy Courtney. He created and leads something. He's the CEO of Preemptive Love Coalition. Now, Preemptive Love really states the way Jeremy lives his life. He not only lives there with his family, but he's actually meeting the needs of refugees who are spilling into the borders, and for those in Iraq who are still struggling after the war to get their lives back together. And we're going to get to hear his perspective as somebody who lives in the Middle East on what he sees taking place in the midst of this crisis. Let's listen to Jeremy now.
It was fall 2013. We were in Iraq. We'd been there nearly 6 years, I guess, by that point. And I had a medical team on the way to Fallujah. You may hear the word Fallujah, and it may ring a bell. Fallujah is one of the most nefarious cities that a very terrible reputation developed around the city of Fallujah during the Iraq War. It was the site of some major atrocities. It became known as the bomb factory. It was home to Al-Qaeda, the place from which they sent out so many of these suicide bombers during the war years and the sectarian violence years inside Iraq. And we were bringing a medical team into Fallujah. We had been trying to get some various Iraqi and American partners to work with us in that space, but as you can imagine, it was hard to find people who wanted to go into Fallujah at that time. And so we had a medical team coming in, and I got the call that while we were en route, the mayor of Fallujah had been assassinated. This was early ISIS. This was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, continuing to rebel against the forces that were at play there, trying to carve out their ground. And so they had assassinated the mayor of Fallujah, and it derailed our mission and shut off our work that we had been doing in Fallujah for a couple of years then at that point. And as the events played out over the next couple of days and weeks, it metastasized really significantly. The government ended up falling altogether in Fallujah and hasn't been back in government control since, nearly 2 years on. From Fallujah, massive protests started growing in Iraq into neighboring cities that you may have heard of as well. Ramadi, another city to the north, ended up being the site of a protest, and the Iraqi government ended up bombing the protesters because they did have some ISIS elements inside the protest. And then when they bombed these people that were largely peaceful and just protesting for their own rights and protesting to see their women let free and let out of jail and protesting to see their youth and their entire Sunni identity not broad-brushed as terrorist by the Shia majority in the country. As all of that continued playing out, ISIS gained more and more foothold across Iraq. And so then it was in the middle of 2014 that we're in Iraq. ISIS has now grown up and out of the Iraq war. It's grown from being Al-Qaeda to ISIS in Iraq to ISIS in Iraq and greater Syria, and gone cross-border and taken foothold in the Syrian conflict that was going on, and then come back over from Syria into Iraq in some really meaningful ways. And we're in Iraq in the middle of summer 2014, and the city of Mosul, we wake up one morning and the city of Mosul just appears to fall like that. And in fact, it wasn't merely a cross-border operation like you may have heard on the news. It wasn't merely a couple of caravans of ISIS fighters overwhelming and scaring the world out of Iraqi military and causing 30,000 Iraqi military to run. It was something inside Mosul itself. ISIS itself had been inside Mosul, had lived there like a mafia, terrorizing the population. And so this whole thing that we now see is the broad ISIS overtaking so much of Syria and Iraq, in many ways bubbled up from inside Mosul and then was a cross-border operation as well. And overnight, Mosul fell, and then you started seeing these stories about Christians being marked for expropriation of their property or extermination of their people altogether. Maybe you remember this small little ethno-religious group that got trapped on a mountain. And CNN coverage, Fox News coverage of this crisis of these people who had been chased up a mountain, stranded, throwing their babies off the side of the mountain because they were starving to death. And it seemed more merciful to them to give their kids an easier way out than pure starvation. We have so many friends whose moms and sisters and brothers were slaughtered by ISIS as they fled up that mountain. And then U.S. airstrikes came and U.S. aid came to help liberate these people and provide for them in their darkest time. And in that time, no one really knew what ISIS's capabilities were. I mean, it just seemed like every day they were taking new land and growing. And a lot of aid organizations that existed still in the region were pulling out, and a lot of companies and oil was pulling out. And we were trying to figure out how, with our nearly 10 years of experience in Iraq at that time, we could press in. And it's not that we weren't gripped by fear. We were. But when we launched out on this journey nearly 10 years ago, we launched out with this vision that our church, men and women like you, instilled into us when you laid your hands on us and commissioned us to go out into the world and told us that You were sending us, and Jesus was sending us in the same way that the Father sent the Son, that we were being sent as Jesus was sent, that if Jesus was sent to die, then we would be sent to die. If Jesus was sent to lay down his life for his enemies, then we would be sent to lay down our life for our enemies. So my main question, I guess, here this morning is, are you still preaching that? Are you still pushing your people? Are you still pushing the pew? Are you still discipling and nurturing this conversation? The fear is real. I still feel the fear almost every day. Just days ago, we had ISIS rockets full of chemicals flying over our heads. In days prior, we've been the first on the scene after ISIS has successfully bombed villages, and we've still seen people going blind over here and animals writhing on the ground over here because of ISIS's chemical weapons. We can see the ISIS flag just there on the horizon. We are terrified many days of the week, but we love anyway, because that's what you taught us to do. And so in the wake of Paris and in the wake of Brussels and in the wake of San Bernardino and in the fear that we have inside us about immigration and what if they come and they overrun our country, are you awake? Are you still awake to this Jesus message that you've aligned your hearts around, that woke you up to this story in the first place, that Jesus calls us to go and lay down our lives just as he did? Are you calling your people bravely, humbly, to lean into this fearful moment and love anyway? It's not that we deny the fear. And I think that's sometimes been a very polarizing dynamic in this conversation. As we talk about the Syrian and Iraqi refugee crisis, sometimes the poles of the conversation have been, why are you such a warmonger? And why are you so afraid of everyone? And why do you want to go all the way over to this side and lock down the borders and not let people in? Why are you so afraid? And then on the other side, it's like, why are you so naive? Why do you think that if we just let people in and we love anyway, why is your co-option of this word love, why are you painting us out to be haters? And I think this dialectic between the two can be really hurtful and harmful. And we're not saying that the fear is unreal, and we're not saying that the love should be naive. This, I entirely agree with Steve. This is going to be with us for some decades now. But between these two poles, between the side of your church communities or your civic communities that are pulling you toward one thing or the other, I just want to suggest that the Jesus way lives above all of that. We should live above the leftist policies and the right policies, and we should find a way to be more inclusive and rise above all of that. The fear is real. The risk is real. The way that we might lose our lives in the process, the way that we might lose our position, our churches might lose their influence, all of that is real. Embrace it, hug it, love it, lean into it. That's exactly what we were called to do in the first place. We don't know where this situation goes from here. We don't know what's going to happen next, but I do know it's going to take continued generosity and bravery and leadership from friends like you. I know it's going to continue to take friends like World Vision leading the way on the ground in some of the hardest places of these conflicts. It's going to continue to take more and more sending, more and more discipleship, and more hard conversations pastorally, lovingly with our people, where we dare to bring them along in this. I know a lot of the fear is surrounding this conversation about Islam and Christianity. Do you know Muslims? Are you reaching out to Muslims in your community? Are you walking across the street to the mosque? Are you helping your people walk across the street to the mosque and form those relationships? Those are some of the things that I think we're going to have to figure out how to do and how to do a little bit better. This is the most important humanitarian crisis in the history of the world. The numbers are there, the statistics are there, and I can tell you when you're on the ground, living it, looking into the faces of these people, that the stories and the pain is real. But we can, as Steve's numbers show us, we can make a significant impact in this moment. And if we don't show up, we're completely irrelevant. We should just pack it up and go home. I know that's not what you guys want to do. I know that's why you're here. I know you have everything inside you by the grace of God and the Holy Spirit to lean into this moment. And I believe that together we can make a significant impact on this. Thank you, guys.
Those final words from Jeremy Courtney, that we have to show up. I mean, I think if you're listening to this, it's convicting, because you go, oh, well, how do I show up? And I think for many of us, You want to jump on a plane, you want to show up physically, but part of how we show up is to support those who are already there, who have access to the networks, who really need cash. They need money. They need support to do their work best, to do it in the most speedy way possible. And so preemptivelove.org is a place you can go to learn more about Jeremy's work. It's PREEMPTIVE, love.org. And I would encourage you to learn more about their story, see how they're actually helping people who have suffered from some of the effects of war actually recover. They've helped give people jobs. They've helped them learn how to make soap and do all kinds of cool things. And I think you'll really appreciate Jeremy's creative approach to not only trying to stop what's happening with the violence, but actually to show up afterwards and help people redevelop and resettle their lives. So check out preemptivelove.org, and just thank you again for listening with us, for going deep into something that I know is hard and difficult to hear, but it's part of where we as Christians have to show up. And so I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you'll pass along to others who you know might have questions about what's actually happening in the Middle East. This will be a great episode to share with them. And I look forward to being with you on the next episode.